Hey class, welcome back to our next set of notes, Unit 4B, discussing our land and water use and specifically the impacts of industrialized agriculture. That to me starts off with a really critical concept here is the tragedy of the commons. We move on to irrigation and pest control methods as well as methods of sustainable agriculture. The picture you're looking at here is one of our impacts of industrialized agriculture, which is our dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, resulting from runoff of fertilizers through the Mississippi River Basin here. That results in a hypoxic, low oxygen area due to eutrophication, a process that we'll outline later in the course, but clearly an impact of large-scale industrialized agriculture. To begin with, this critical concept of the tragedy of the commons comes up and is outlined real well in this picture here. Essentially, you have a nice green, lush pasture with some sheep. This is a commons area because it is a shared resource in which all people or individuals can benefit on its use. If multiple people occupy that shared resource with their grazing animals, eventually they will continue to maximize their individual gain and deplete that resource. So the animals will be above carrying capacity in this case, and then the area becomes depleted, essentially, of its resource, the grass here. The final picture shows that the environmental costs aren't accounted for, and eventually that shared resource is completely depleted, and the land is unable to support that activity. So in reality, we're talking about the scenario where any shared resource, whether it's air, water, soil, forests, oceans, those things, because they're shared typically and don't have ownership, people will use the resources and tend to exploit them if they're looking for short-term gain. And this is going to degrade the resource over time. This is the tragedy of the commons. This concept is suggested that that's kind of the human nature, that people will behave in this way. There are solutions to this. One of those is private ownership. If people privately own this patch of grass, they'll use it for what they need, and if they want someone else to be on it, they will regulate that because it is their land. That's kind of the same idea behind the government regulating behaviors on shared resources. You could also discuss the idea that the tragedy of the commons doesn't happen if there's group management of that shared resource. So even if there's not private ownership, even if there's not regulation, if the group and all people using it abide by a set of rules and self-regulate that resource, that can also prevent this tragedy of the commons from occurring. Industrialized farming practices do have problems with our commons when we talk about the atmosphere, common resource, the Earth's lithosphere, the solid earth soil components, hydrosphere, and biosphere. So we want to jot these down and make sure we understand these soil erosion, loss of fertility, desertification, salinization. All of these components have come up so far in our soil unit, and those are all can be amplified through industrialized agriculture. The atmosphere. We've also discussed greenhouse gases. That's the primary focus, is more industrialized mechanization of our agricultural system. The more fossil fuels are needed, generating things like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxides, and methane. Hydrosphere. What happens? Well, we need more crops. We're growing more crops. We need more water. Aquifer depletion is an issue, in addition to pollution from fertilizers, pesticides, which can also lead to eutrophication. And then finally, loss of biodiversity. We can get resistant pests, which we'll discuss in a moment. Bioaccumulation, which will come a little later in this course, and things like antibiotic resistance, all as a result of our quest for creating more food and food in a more efficient way. One of the ways we can deplete aquifers and cause other water issues in general is our irrigation methods. Plants need water, crops need water, so we have to find a way to get that water to them. So we have 4 major types of irrigation methods. They're all awarded medals in terms of their efficiency. Drip irrigation is the most efficient type of irrigation system that we utilize. Drip irrigation, you can see, is just a water line that is running next to the plant, and there's little holes poked in those lines, and they drip near the root structures or plant root structures to avoid a lot of that water being evaporated or lost to evaporation. So only about 5% of this water is lost due to evaporation and runoff. The downside is it's an expensive kind of model for irrigation. The second place efficiency is our spray irrigation. Spray irrigation really involves pumping of groundwater from our aquifers into these spray nozzles, just like a giant sprinkler that you would use in your yard essentially. And the system is definitely more efficient than the other ones below, flood and furrow irrigation. We still lose about 1/4, 25% of the water to evaporation. Spray irrigation systems tend to be more of a Med-C kind of developed nation luxury, the same as our drip irrigation systems, being a little more technology, pumps to run them, a little more expensive, have to maintain and fix them. Coming down to third place is flood irrigation. This is a pretty primitive kind of concept, but it makes sense. You could have a canal or a water source that just runs off into a field and floods the entire area over. So flood irrigation has about 20% of its water lost to evaporation, or runoff. So this number starts to go up. This really can lead to waterlogging of the soil, which is too much water, and the plants can struggle to get oxygen in the roots. So there's a downside with that too. We also end up with the last place medal is furrow irrigation, which is really creating cutting little furrows between, or these little kind of mini channels essentially to have the water flow next to the crops. In furrow irrigation, we have a system that is pretty cheap, like flood irrigation, but about 30%-ish of the water is lost due to evaporation here. So it is the least efficient in terms of its use. What is the problem with evaporating water? It leads to salinization of the soil, where there's salts, dissolved salts in all the water here, and as the water evaporates at a higher rate, salts are left behind, and that can build up in the soil and become toxic to plants over time. The other thing is aquifer depletion. Obviously, all these rely on a water source. Many times it's groundwater, and pumping aquifers is where we have a lot of the water lost. So how do we farm sustainably? How do we make sustainable management or sustainable agriculture reality? Well, we have a couple of methods here all outlined in these gray boxes. The benefits to all of them are improving soil fertility, reducing erosion, increasing biodiversity, adopting this no-till agriculture where we don't turn the soil every single time before we replant, and we can use less fertilizer and pesticide if managed properly. So some things we do: crop rotations, new species and plants in various years, so you could alternate years, alternate crops, some that are more nitrogen intensive one year, and some that can be less nitrogen intensive or put nitrogen back into the soil. So alternating is important in understanding the soil fertility and preventing loss of fertility and erosion. Strip cropping is another one. This is really alternating rows of different types of crops. So you see one type then another. So here it looks like we have some corn between these trees, probably some fruit trees here, and we alternate back and forth. This is beneficial, providing just general diversity in your crop. It also can serve as a little bit of a windbreak. It can prevent runoff of water, which is important, and reduce erosion in that aspect. Speaking of windbreaks, just coming down below, some fields just have windbreaks, so they're just trees, taller plants that are planted to prevent stronger winds from whipping through the crops and taking away the topsoil, the nutrient-dense topsoil there. And you can kind of see the windbreaks highlighted up here too in this area around the edge of this crop rotation field. Planting perennial crops is another thing. Perennial crops come back every year, so they don't need to be replanted like an annual, and they tend to have deeper root systems as a result of that, which tend to reduce erosion and hold soil in place. Contour plowing and terracing are these two down here on the bottom left. Contour plowing is planting based on the shape of the land, so these are kind of the dips the hills and valleys that exist, and going with the shape of the land, the topography of the land, so parallel to reduce runoff and erosion as well. And then terracing is more of a stair-step kind of approach on a hillside, so you can see that there's flattened areas, then we level up flattened areas. This also helps to slow runoff and erosion. Cover crops planted in between crops, vegetation planted in between crops, helps to do the same kind of concept to keep the topsoil in place instead of having bare soil in between your rows of plants. One of the ways we can maintain focus on sustainable agriculture is to utilize this integrated pest management philosophy. Integrated pest management, or IPM, is what you'll start to see it abbreviated as. So I get used to seeing that. IPM goes through this kind of triangle over here of prevention to intervention, and the idea that we want to start to look at pest management from a least intensive, least toxic preventative measure to worst case scenario, a toxic pesticide application. So down at the bottom here, we're going to discuss the cultural changes. So if I'm trying to manage pest behavior, one thing I should look at first is the cultural controls. This is a behavioral practice that would reduce the pest ability to spread. And so one thing like here would be changing behavior like crop rotation. If there's pests that have been affecting year after year, rotating that crop in and out so the pests can't get well established could be one way to create a cultural change in pest management. If behavioral changes like that don't work, then the physical mechanical is employed. So trying to directly kill the pest by isolating and removing it, but not applying anything foreign to your crop. So things like traps are a good one, like insect traps or mouse traps. Like try to get rid of the pest and remove them from the area without putting anything additional to it. The next one is biological controls. If we have a hard time trapping them, then using their natural predators might be good. So if I have a problem with rodents, installing owl boxes and having owls on my property to take care of these rodents instead of putting traps out there because it's too hard to trap, biocontrol is a good way to do that. Finally, we move into the chemical section, and when we talk about chemical controls, there's really two. There's the biorational chemicals, and then there's your conventional, which are typically persistent chemicals. The biorational refers to components that are made from natural or biological sources. So what we start talking about there is something like citronella is one of the big ones that you could use to be an insect kind of repellent or deterrent that is from a plant, a natural source. And then persistent chemicals are the man-made chemicals that we tend to hear about, things that are your classic pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides. This is the poison that we put into the land to kill the organisms, would be the last choice in integrated pest management. The pros of good pest management focus down on the bottom three tiers, right? So we want to talk about the pros, kind of all encompassing these sections here. Sometimes jumping up into the chemical application, try to avoid that. And then the cons is that dealing in this area can be complex and expensive, and this can be much less expensive at the top here. All right, it can be, not always, but you're also committing long term. If you don't deal with your pests another way, you're going to have to continue to spray. That can also lead to insect or pesticide resistance as well if we don't, if we continue to apply that pesticide.